Here we go. Hi, everybody. We're live. Thank you for stopping by. I'm here with Rhyd from Gods and Radicals, which is a pagan anti-capitalist organization, blog, and also a publisher, which is really awesome. I would like to hand it over to Rhyd now. If you'd like to tell us a little bit about Gods and Radicals and, you know, the backstory behind it.
Yeah. Okay. Hi, everybody. First of all, really excited to be on here. This is pretty cool. Angie Speaks is awesome. So I'm Rhyd Wildermuth. I'm one of the two people who co-founded Gods and Radicals. We did this almost 4 years ago now, which is pretty crazy. We started it, I started it with my best friend, Ali Valkyrie. And we started it because we were completely annoyed that we couldn't find anybody who was talking about paganism and anti-capitalism together. And both of us had gotten into witchcraft, magic, paganism, etc., you know, from very similar ways, but we were both anarchists as well. And it was just really strange. We couldn't find anybody. We were like the only two people we knew, and it was like, hey, let's do this. We ended up giving a presentation at a pagan conference, and when we did that, we got like 75 people in a room that could only fit 20 people because the conference organizers didn't think anybody was going to come. And that night we bought the URLs and we're like, all right, let's do a blog. Like, this will be great. And then it became a publisher, and then it became, well, just pretty big, which is pretty exciting. Yeah, now here we are.
Yeah, I'm super happy to have found you guys. I think that it's been such a like rich pool of resources for me, specifically because I didn't think anybody was out there doing it, but lo and behold, it just took a quick Google and I just kind of fell into all the things that you guys had been doing, and it felt like I had finally found a place almost. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah, I think what happened is we just sort of raised a flag. And when we raised the flag, all of these other people saw and they're like, hey, I've been wanting to do this too, or I've been doing this too. And, you know, we keep finding more and more and more people who are doing this, you know, stuff like you. Like it's kind of all over, and it's been very self-evident to a lot of people that yes, like magic, animism, spirituality, and resistance to capitalism are, you know, almost inextricable, but it's never been like that for all of the mainstream left, which I'm sure we'll talk about at some point.
Of course. And especially because for quite a few of us anyway, it was actually my spiritual paradigm that led me towards the left. It was kind of following breadcrumbs, like the breadcrumb trail in that regard, which was quite a really wonderful kind of uplifting process to kind of arrive there in a way that was sort of heart-centered, not necessarily completely and utterly like in the realm of the intellectual in that regard.
Yeah, you know, my path was, I mean, it was kind of contorted, but breadcrumbs is about the same way. You know, I would describe it like that as well. Plus a couple of you know, big like hitting me over the head sort of things from spirits, you know, that were like, yeah, no, this is where it needs to go. This is where it needs to go. And I think this has been kind of the same process for a lot of people, you know, and I want to go back just for a second, because you said you were like really excited to find us. Like, I was really excited to find you. Like, I'm always excited when more people are doing this, and especially when they do it so lucidly and so like just clearly for people. So I think.
Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah. One of the things I've noticed, just in general, in the left, there's always this assumption that everybody already knows everything, or that they had a college education, they went to, you know, graduate school, et cetera, to be able to understand things. I never finished college, and I know a lot of people who are like that as well, and it's much hiding information behind, you know, the obscurantism of academic language, beating people over the head when they don't understand a concept that, you know, people with academic training assume is just self-evident. and also
Oh yeah.
just the left in general not bothering to speak to people in the way that they speak has been a huge problem, and I'm really always excited to see other people trying to do the same thing.
Oh yeah, I totally resonate with that, because I went to film school, so it wasn't as if I had like the traditional kind of liberal arts education, even though there was contextual studies, which kind of introduced me to critical theory, and then it was kind of a downhill slope from there. So that was the element of film school that was the most academic in that regard. But I'm a creative kind of artist first and foremost. So the things that tend to resonate with me are the things that sort of speak to the subconscious, things that kind of speak to me on that level. Whereas the really kind of rigidly academic stuff doesn't necessarily vibe with me. So that's partially why I found leftism through spirituality and art rather than the kind of traditional means. Was it a similar journey for you?
Yeah, so my first experience with like reading leftist philosophers was hanging out in a punk coffee shop in Seattle, I guess almost 20 years ago. I met this cool, awesome woman, like single mother punk, who was reading Deleuze and Guattari. She didn't finish high school, you know.
Wow.
And she was talking about this, like, hey, have you read Capitalism and Schizophrenia? And I'm like, no, what is this? This sounds great, you know. And I met a lot of people like that as well. And many of them were also pagan to some extent, or occultists, or, you know, dabbled, I guess, the same way that pretty much everybody in the world sort of dabbles, even if they're, you know, overtly secularist. But, you know, the people I met tended to be, you know, more spiritual, I guess, than the average people.
Mm.
You know, and sometimes we'd have conversations about the connections to that, but yeah, never in a very clear way. And we always knew we weren't supposed to talk about these things in especially anarchist circles. You know,
Oh yeah.
I worked with a bunch of different groups, like you know, some Trotskyists, some kind of mainstream socialist groups, lots of anarchist groups as well. And honestly, the most shit that we got whenever we talked about spirituality was from the anarchists. You know, like,
Oh
there's
yeah.
who just kind of like, you know, pat me on the head and like, oh, that's cute. But you'd have anarchists always just, you know, screaming at you, like, what are you doing? Like, you must be a fascist if you believe in magic, you know, stuff like that. So,
Oh.
yeah. So
It always really confused me, like because I feel like people are really still sort of in the dark in terms of how much this stuff like has an impact on history, especially Western history. You know, mysticism is something that is like pretty much everywhere in almost every aspect of life. And I feel like people think it's kind of just reserved to the kind of weird fringe, which is I think part of the issue.
I think, you know, I think you're definitely right, but there've always been people pointing to the fact that, you know, particularly, you know, anarchism is a predominantly European tradition. Communism is predominantly European. Most of these kind of leftist things come from the European context. And what they took with them was European exceptionalism, like the idea that Europe is a completely different context from everywhere else. They have somehow progressed further than every other society currently existing or that it existed before. Everything else is primitive. People who believe in spirits or talk to trees or what have you are all backwards and, you know, savages, etc. And that's just continued on, and it keeps continuing on even still. But at the same time, you've always had these people, you know, even in these traditions who have pointed to, you know, something else. Like a great example, like Max Weber. You know, he really
Mm.
pushed the thing that, you know, while Europe was ostensibly secular, it was pretty clear that it was still using all of this Christian, you know, the Christian framework
Mm.
to govern, like politics. They removed God, but when they removed God, like that space still existed, and instead of God, it became the state, or became liberal democracy, or became capital. But nothing actually changed. Kierkegaard even like pointed to this too. But the people that you've seen pointing to this problem the most have been like people in post-colonial societies, like Deepesh Chakrabarty, I think, is probably like the most profound critic of that European exceptionalism, where he talked about how Europeans actively try not to see the magical thinking, the spirituality, and the mysticism that's right in front of them. They say, we're not like that, we don't do that, and yet they continue to do that, and you see that even now in the kind of Anglo-American context, that people say, oh, we're not spiritual, but they're still using all of the same spiritual frameworks, but that feel like they're smarter than Africans, they're smarter than South Americans, they're smarter than people in Asia who are worshiping ancestors, etc. Like, oh, we're not like that, but they are. They just do not.
Exactly, I agree. So first of all, I think we should address the elephant in the room, because my audience is like quite mixed. I mean, like when I did my video on the politics of witchcraft, there were quite a few people who were like, oh, I'm a neo-pagan, or oh, I'm a Jungian, or this or that. But then there are also people who are secular and have absolutely no idea what we're talking about or why it's important. So the first question that I do have for you is, why leftist occultism? Most secularly minded people on the left don't really see the importance of this paradigm. Why is it important to understand the historical relevance of magic working in tandem with political structures?
Well, so there's this really funny thing. I wish I could remember the name of the title. I just finished reading it. But it's from a feminist anarchist writer. She just wrote, it was called The Occult Features of Anarchism. And she just kind of wrote a history that was like, hey, I know anarchists are all like, oh, no, not a cult. And she's like, but everything was a cult. Like all of, the majority of the anarchists, if they were not ostensibly, openly, oh yeah, we believe in the occult, they were operating through occult societies. They were borrowing the occult society organizations that were existing at the time. My favorite thing is the anarchy symbol comes from a group of anarchists that were using the Freemason organizations to spread their anarchist ideas. And they're like, hey, we're just going to take this Freemason symbol and we're going to make it just the A, and there you go. And so when we put that symbol everywhere, like we're using an occult symbol, one that we've retooled, one that we understand has profound power. You can put an anarchy A up somewhere, and you'll get white middle class people, really freaked out. That's a symbol of power right there.
Yeah, totally.
So that's the short answer. Like the short answer is, these things have always been using elements of the occult. Like I can go through Marx, who Marx was absolutely totally intolerant of any sort of occultism whatsoever. But then you read Das Kapital and you're like, this sounds like an alchemical text. Why are you talking about the transmutation of labor and the crystallization of value? And why are you using so many occult references? Like my favorite is capital is dead labor, that vampire like sucks the life of living labor. He's constantly using these references. Like, as much as you hated the occultism, and Marx is not nearly as bad as Lenin and Stalin were. Lenin and Stalin were utterly hostile and violent against any sort of occultism, but then they use the same thing anyway. So there's that, and then there's also, when you look at how many atheists there are in the world, not including the official Chinese state statistics, where everybody is atheist because they deny all of the animist traditions that are going on there, because no one's supposed to be doing any of those things. But atheism is a really tiny percentage of humanity. Everybody has like some sort of affiliation with some sort of religious idea, and even, you know, and there are more people who are affiliated with, you know, animistic ideas than they are with any official religions. The vast majority of the world is you know, has these beliefs, and if we are going to, and I say we, you know, by leftist, but you know, even that is kind of, sometimes I don't feel like leftist, I feel like a post-leftist. But if we're going to try to iterate some better world that doesn't involve the exploitation of labor, of the planet, of women, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and then we're going to say, oh, but it can't have any spiritual elements whatsoever, like, then you can't do that. You there's no way to convince like so many billions of people, like, get rid of your ideas, get rid of your beliefs, get rid of all of your experiences. These are false because we have the right way. I mean, it's very Christian of us, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and also like incredibly sort of Enlightenment-esque, kind of Eurocentric as well. It's
Christian, yeah.
It's quite interesting to see the sort of tendrils of occultism in politics throughout history, and how that has influenced both the right and the left. I think that the elements of it that have influenced the right are things that we see a little bit more in culture in terms of its prominence, but in terms of how it's influenced the left, specifically the radical left, that's something that's not necessarily easy to come by in terms of information or even discuss, because the information is so sparse. I know that you mentioned the anarchy symbol being an occult symbol, and I know that you mentioned Marx's Das Kapital using alchemical language. My kind of theory behind it is that you can't really, because those things had such a huge influence on Western culture. Like alchemy, for instance, is something that had a massive influence on scientific thought, on medicinal thought, all of the different things that we benefit from today, even though it's kind of been dismissed as bunk science. But conceptually, I feel like there's a lot of meat there to look at, definitely. Are there any specific occult leftist movements within the Western paradigm that aren't necessarily linked to things like Freemasonry or anything like that? Was there some kind of secret society that we don't know about or anything like that?
Yeah, so I think the problematic part in there is the Western, because when we say Western, like, it's so much easier to deny, and I'm not saying you're doing this at all. It's so much easier to deny any sort of spiritual connection to resistance to capitalism when you just look at the European context, you know. But then, you know, if you look, here's a recent example. In Cambodia a few years ago, and this is apparently still happening. In Cambodia, and I apologize, I don't remember the name of the land spirits, but they're animist, and a lot of their ancestor tree spirits. So it's land spirit, but also an ancestor spirit at the same time. It's a really fascinating view of the world. These get cut down all of the time to make factories, and the majority of the factories that are getting built up are textile factories, because we're repeating the same process that happened at the beginning of capitalism, where, you know, you take the poorest places and you put textile factories there to make clothing. But there were repeated instances of women going into possessory trances, and those possessory trances were them channeling the land spirits that had been destroyed or had been dislocated by the factories. And there were several strikes in a lot of the factories, all led by women, all of them going into possessory states, all of them channeling what the land spirits were demanding of the factory owners, you know. And,
Wow.
and this shut down multiple factories, and some of them, there was one factory where the owner eventually conceded to give the women half-hour lunch breaks because they weren't getting lunch breaks at all, and give them 8-hour work days, and then give offerings to the land spirit and build a shrine on the factory floor, basically. All because these women were channeling this land spirit, and this land spirit was like, "You need to do this for these women, otherwise I will destroy your factory." You know,
Wow.
like, so, you know, it's
Even
really,
just like on a psychological level, that's like something really powerful. Yeah.
and by the way, this was covered by the New York Times a few years ago. I you know, maybe I can email you the link for this later. But there are instances of this in Europe at the beginning, and you see this primarily in the Celtic lands more than you see it in any of the other areas. So you see this in Britannia, which is where I live right now, northwest France. You see this more often in Wales than you do in Eastern England. You see this in Ireland. But you know, you also saw this in England as well. So the Luddites. The Luddites are the best example of this.
Yeah.
The Luddites claimed to be following a captain or a king or a general. His name was Ned Lud or General Lud or King Lud or what have you. And they always reported that he lived in a mound or under a mound or under a church or in a well or in a cave, and usually always in the area where Sherwood Forest, you know, is. Um, and so whenever they did actions, they claimed to be led by this, you know, king, captain, general, whatever, who, you know, as much as as much as he was claimed to be a general and a king, you know, he was awfully anarchist. You know, the phrase was no king but Lud does the worker any good, or I think it was no general but Lud. So you have that, and then if you go over to Ireland, you've got the White Boys, kind of like what became the Molly Maguires, and a couple of other movements. They were all part of the leveling movement, where, you know, people would take down fences during the enclosure period. They would issue evictions in the name of Queen Seb, or Queen Sav, I think it was, who is an old Irish goddess.
Oh.
If the landlord refused to give into their demands, and they would burn it down. They were all claiming, "Hey, yeah, no, we worship Queen Seb. We are the children of Seb." And then another example in Wales, the Rebeccas. The Rebeccas. These are great. One thing I should add too. I'm sorry, I could talk forever on this. I'll try not to go too much on it, but all of these movements were cross-dressing movements, where men dressed up as women and the women dressed up as men. And you see this most in the Rebeccas in Wales. Again, another leveling movement, where they'd go and they'd tear down fences during the enclosures. And they claimed every single time someone, one of the guards tried to stop them, you know, and they're like, "Hey, why are you women wearing women's clothes? Where did you get this from?" They'd all claim that an old crone gave it to them, and they had a word for her, and I can't remember what the word is, but basically, you know, an old goddess gave them women's clothes and said, "Wear these women's clothes and go attack the landowners and the factory owners." So, you know, there are so many stories like this, and again, like I said, you see this much more in the kind of Anglo-Celtic area. You see a couple of stories like this in Britannia as well. From a completely secular stance, you know, people say it's kind of the equivalent of you know, kind of a propaganda effort on these you know, early resistance fighters. They were just kind of, you know, creating this idea that would kind of help unite them. But so many of these things have so many of these spirits that they were supposedly following have all of these cognates and all of these rich histories before the coming of Christianity in those regions, that one almost starts to see, well, wait, looks like there was this very long-term pagan resistance to Christianity, and then when capitalism arose, you know, they kind of merged there, and so we're talking like mid 1700s, early 1800s, exactly when what we now call the left was founded.
Mm, mm, for sure, for sure. So I guess the short answer to the question would be because, you know, there's a very long history of resistance movements and leftist movements working in tandem. And regardless of whether or not you are somebody who necessarily sees it as something you want to know more about, or, you know, be involved with, quote unquote, it's still something that's important to know about, even if it's just in terms of imagery, archetypes, and being able to understand the things that inspired those who came before us in that regard, which is kind of how I put it forward on my channel, because obviously you can't really push metaphors on people, but you know, you can still try and.
But one thing I would add, it is, you know, and anti-colonial and post-colonialist thought have really kind of helped push this. You see the same stuff, and even more often, you know, the spiritual resistance, invoking gods, spirits, ancestors, the lands, the stars, etc. You see all of this in indigenous groups, and you see this much more often than you do in the European context, because these groups have been not fully colonized, like they have not fully lost their ancestral traditions. So while it is always good to kind of keep a open mind and, you know, kind of have a dose of cynicism when it comes to reports of spiritual resistance, it's also kind of colonialist to deny that those things happen when the vast majority of the indigenous resistance invokes all of these things. So to say, you know, okay, these are just kind of metaphors, etc., that means every single one of these other, you know, resistance movements that we'd call leftist, except, you know, they don't know anything about Marx, they don't know anything about Proudhon, they don't fucking care about like a bunch of dead white guys. You know, but when they invoke those things, you know, for us to say, you know, oh, well, that's kind of a useful social form for them, is to directly call them liars. You know, like to say, oh, well, they don't know any better because they haven't reached like our progressive, atheist, secular, enlightened whiteness, really. You know, so.
It's really interesting because to talk about these things is to almost break leftist orthodoxy in that regard. And I come from two different worlds. So I'm originally Nigerian, I'm originally Yoruba, but obviously colonial subject, lived in England and America for most of my life, but I still kind of have very deep roots in Yoruba culture and tradition. So like I was raised in a Christian household, because Christianity and Islam are the two kind of main colonial religions of Nigeria at the moment. But there's still a very deep belief in animism. We have a pretty strong pantheon. I mean, the Yoruba religion is, you find it in hoodoo, you find it in voodoo, you find it in you know, South America, where they're invoking like Yemaya or, you know, any other Yoruba goddess or god or whatever. And it's also been really intrinsic to Black resistance movements. It's been like a huge part of Black resistance movements, but it's always sort of just a whispering or undertone. Because growing up, you know, I had to go to church and do all the things that I had to do in order to be a good little Christian girl. But my grandmother still had like a charm outside her shop, and it was like a little fetish idol that she would keep there. And I remember one day asking her, like, what is that? What is it for? And she said, oh, it's to stop thieves. And I was like, how the hell does that stop a thief from entering the shop? And she said, oh, basically what it does is it like kind of takes over their consciousness. So she would leave like a broom next to it, and if the thief came to the shop, they would immediately grab the broom and get into a trance and start sweeping the floor until they were knocked out of the trance by getting slapped in the face or apprehended in some way. And I remember laughing a lot when she told me this, but she was like, no, I'm dead serious. This is a charm that I've had for years, and it's protected my shop from thieves. And at the time, I was just kind of like, okay, grandma, like, sure thing. This is just some, you know, chicken noodle soup for the soul type of stuff, like, whatever. But there was almost, she almost felt betrayed that I didn't believe her. And going by what you said about it being this sort of colonial mentality to kind of dismiss these like age-long traditions isn't something that's necessarily come to my consciousness before, specifically because my paradigm is like pretty much Jungian. Like I see things, I kind of dance in between the territories. So rational Angie is like, this is all just like metaphors. This is all just kind of things that inspire and allow one to draw from a deep well of archetypal imagery, blah, blah, blah. But then there are certain experiences that I've had that have completely contradicted that. So it really depends on what day you catch me, because, you know, some days I'm like a Jungian and other days I'm like fully like in the clouds, like somewhere else. So I totally understand what you're saying.
Jung is kind of brilliant that way, because like, you know, as someone like, you know, who experiences gods and spirits and does magic, I can read Jung and approach him the same way that someone who is completely secular but understands that there's some sort of metaphorical sort of thing going on with people. You know, we can both approach Jung at the exact same time from different directions and be like, oh, this is a convenient bridge. You know, like, and I think Jungianism, or Jung, pretty much kind of created, you know, a kind of, I don't know, call it like a pigeon. You know, it was like a language that two completely different people or different groups of people could use together and not fully understand what the other one is talking about, but at least communicate enough to kind of, you know, get stuff done. You know.
Yeah. I mean, there's even a lot of debate as to whether Jung himself was a occultist or a mystic. I mean, I know that he was kind of an understudy of Freud, and then Freud was like completely horrified by what he was doing, because Freud was like, you're going to unleash a dark wave of occultism with all this fucking gods and monsters nonsense you're talking about. You really need to stop. But like Jung himself, it's really unclear. I think he was kind of like me in the sense where he kind of danced in both territories of kind of being completely secular minded and seeing these things as metaphors and seeing them as useful metaphors, but also having crazy experiences that contradicted that and not really knowing what to do with that or how to reconcile that. Because I feel I call, oh, sorry, I was just going to say, one of the really interesting texts that I was reading was Liber Null by who is it again? It's one of the chaos magic guys. Read it a really long time ago. But they kind of talk about this thing that's called like the censor, how like anything that doesn't conform to like consensus reality kind of gets censored out, because we're kind of operating on this kind of level of consciousness in order to like, you know, function and be people in society. And I kind of feel like whenever something has broken through that censor, it's kind of been shocking, and it's very difficult to articulate and really find understanding. And I don't even know if it's possible, because in order to articulate things that are going on within your own consciousness, or maybe even outside, like I don't know, like I'm very agnostic about it all.
So I mean, you know, and this is both Jungian and Freudian and also Lacanian, like, you know, we have to protect our psyches, you know, like when you know, if you look at a lot of indigenous cultures, there's often some sort of form of what is commonly called shaman sickness. You know, and this takes different forms and has many different names and whatever. Shaman Sickness is just the one that most people I think would probably know. It's very similar to what Jung talks about with Negredo, when he's talking about anarchy. Even the Christian mystics, like Saint John of the Cross, call it like the dark night of the soul, etc. There's always this point where when you start experiencing things that don't fit into the paradigm or the soul, I guess the psyche, there's this moment where things start to break down, and our tendency is to want to close that off really quickly. For some people, it's possible to kind of continue doing that, never looking at those things again, avoiding any experiences with the occult or anything else that triggered those moments of kind of panic. You can do that, but most people can only do that for so long. The best to bring in tarot, it's the tower. It's the moment.
Yeah,
the tower is meant to protect, but eventually even like the strongest thing will like kind of break down, and unfortunately the longer and longer and longer you try to protect yourself from those things, the worse the explosion will be. And so like Shaman Sickness, and you see this, again, like I said, in multiple traditions, but like, for many First Nations traditions, this is kind of evident, where somebody starts realizing, hey, I'm hearing spirits. An ancestor came to me and said, I'm supposed to be, a medicine woman or whatever. Or you see this also in, many First Nations cultures and everywhere in the world pretty much have like multiple gender roles. So like a good example is in Navajo, they had 5 genders. And the moment when somebody realizes, oh, I'm actually supposed to be this, I'm supposed to be in this role as spiritual leader, and oh, I'm supposed to wear women's dress because that's actually kind of who I am now. There's an extra part of me that I didn't understand. People who run away from that, they say that they get shaman sickness, where they keep running and running and running, and the more they run, the sicker they get. Like they start experiencing what appears to be mental illness, physical ailments, etc., until they finally give in and say, okay, this is what I'm doing. And the moment they do that, they stop being sick. So I think as you say, with the when things are coming at you and you're trying to protect yourself, or like, I'm not sure if this works, like most of the time we do that just to function in society. It's really hard to go to work when you've got gods breathing down your back. Honestly, like awful. I had what felt like a schizophrenic break myself, until I was like, oh, these dreams that I'm having and these visions I'm having, every single time I close my eyes when I see this like laughing woman by a fire, like, oh, they're real. Okay. And when I finally like acknowledged that, it was a lot easier to go to work the next day. I took a lot of time off during that time. Anyway, sorry.
I'm still not fully there yet in that regard. I still have my fingers a little bit kind of hanging on to the cliff of consensus reality, but I have had certain experience.
Can I say it's okay to be there?
Like, yeah.
I think it's totally okay to be there. Like it's my best friend Allie, when she talks to people, they're like, yeah, I'm trying to experience, or I'm trying to see gods, I'm trying to do this. Her first answer is like, no, don't do it. Because it's and it's not just like, oh, don't do it because like, it's really profound. It's like, oh no, they'll fuck up your life. And it's true, they will. Like next thing you know, you're starting Gods and Radicals and moving to France and stuff. But, like, honestly, that's I guess it's a good thing, but sometimes it really feels not, and really like it
depends on the person
on that bridge.
It's not yeah. it's not for everybody. It's called like esoteric for a reason, because it's not for everybody. But like at the same time, like I think it's kind of important to at least know about in that regard. And then, you know, also there was this really wonderful quote that I think it was you who wrote it, which was like, there are gods who don't care how all of this ends, only that it does, which I think that's so profound. Like when people talk about, you know, trying to have experiences like with divinity or making friends with land spirits and things like that, I think that they, especially when coming at it from a Jungian paradigm, that it's just kind of a reflection of your own consciousness. I think sometimes people run into a lot of issues because, you know, these things, whatever they are, may not necessarily even like us or be on our side. They may not even want to, they may not even be aligned with you or what you're trying to accomplish in that regard. You know, I know that in Yoruba culture, the Orishas are kind of seen as raw nature energy, kind of like raw manifestations of like nature. And, you know, nature it doesn't always necessarily have us or our will in mind, which I think is quite a Christian, I guess, way of looking at divinity in that regard. So yeah, I thought that that was a really profound thing that was said.
I think one of the best examples I've seen are like the gods that are in forests, you know, and the spirits of trees, etc. You know, like the spirit and the gods of a forest that's getting destroyed by global warming or by you know, logging or just, you know, whatever, really doesn't care like what you know, how we govern our cities, you know, and whether or not we have democracy. They just want us dead, you know, and I don't blame them. Like, really, like
Yeah.
we're not doing anything for them. Like, you know, you'll find some spirits that are like, oh, okay, you know, I'll help you, but you guys are killing us. Being in North America for a long time, like I was born in the United States. My experience with the land there and the spirits there versus my experience with the lands in Europe is radically different. And the biggest difference is that the people who were tending to these spirits in North America before were all slaughtered, and they were slaughtered by people who looked like me, you know. And so of course they're not going to be super friendly, and trying to be friendly with them, trying to like convince them, hey, I'm not going to hurt you, is not always easy, you know. You know, there are gods, like I said, who don't care how this ends, only that it does. And if that means that, you know, we all go kill ourselves so forests can live, you know, that suits their goal. I think that our human problem, our human challenge, is to try to find a way to, you know, not kill ourselves and tell them that, like, hey, it's, you know, we figured out a way we can have forests and humans at the same time. Seriously, we can do it. We can do it. But we have a lot of convincing to do, and not just the forest. We have to convince all of the humans that, hey, we need these things.
So on that note, which is kind of feeds into my next question, which is kind of a bit of a surprise question, but it just popped into my head as we were talking. I wanted to ask about liberals and spirituality, because it seems as if a lot of the spiritual paradigm is heavily dominated by liberals, and sort of neoliberal ideology has found its way into spiritual ideas, even though many of these spiritual ideas are completely antithetical when it comes to liberal kind of capitalistic democracies. I personally, whenever I meet pagans who are married to the idea of capitalism, it always perplexes me, because I'm like, how can you be okay with the very system that wants to destroy the things that you worship and that you see as sacred? It is a cognitive dissonance that I don't really understand at all. What are your kind of takes on, you know, liberals within spiritual paradigm? Yeah.
Yeah, that tendency we inherited from Calvinism, I think. You
Mm,
know, and there's lots of things to blame Calvin for, and this is definitely one of those. But the sort of kind of white light paganism, the white light New Age spirituality, where if you just think positively, everything will be okay. Um,
mhm,
that's the thing that tends to, if not embrace capitalism, at least cling to this idea that things are not so bad. Things are
mm,
bad, but they can get better. We can always get better. This is like the Christian progress narrative, like that we're always moving towards like a messianic future. We inherited it from them, and you see that it dominates a lot of, it dominates every spiritual tradition, I think. You see it, very evidently in kind of Christian environmentalists who, when you suggest, hey, we should actually completely deindustrialize, it's like, oh no, we can't go that far, you know um and then you definitely see it in paganism, like in American paganism right now. There's kind of two sort of, there's resistance and resistance light, and resistance light right now is people posting memes about how real witches vote, and
uh,
ballot
uh,
box, was it ballot box magic is a true magic, use it, something like that. And it's
so
like, what, you can just stop now, please.
yeah,
um,
please go away.
but what's funny is, if you look at all of the people who are pushing this, there's like a couple of people, like one is a guy who like makes lots of money off of well, they all make money off of paganism and spirituality. They're all married to capitalism. Like, without capitalism, they would not have any money, and so they can't challenge capitalism. But they know things are wrong, so they kind of get this like white light, like, let's, and they tend to be very social justicey, like, let's protect trans people, let's protect immigrants, let's protect, etc. But when it comes to doing something to actually stop the cause of the harm that is being done to those people, it's like, oh no, 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 no. We just need to pray to the goddess a little bit more, or let's make a fake little sigil that will make everybody happy.
Oh dear. Oh dear.
American paganism, I have to say, is the absolute worst thing that has ever happened in the world. I am glad I am in France now, even though I guess I'm still in American paganism somehow. Anyway.
It's yeah, it's a definitely interesting dichotomy. Because when I was first kind of starting the channel, I thought about, like, because it's like two sides that are two kind of elements that are not necessarily linked culturally right now, but have been for centuries. So that's leftism and, mysticism. And I was thinking, should I lean more to the mystic side or lean more to the left side? Which one's going to give me the most shit, basically? And I realized that the mystic side would probably give me the most shit, because whenever I've been in neo-pagan circles and have dared utter any kind of word about anti-capitalism, or even things like race or anything like that, it's always been met with absolute kind of rejection almost. There have been some instances where it hasn't necessarily been, it's kind of been met with kind of a warm indifference. There's been some people that are like, oh, you're articulating all the things that I've been thinking, but haven't necessarily had a frame for, but that's more few and far between. Whereas on the left, it's like, people are generally kind of like, okay. There are some people who flat out just don't care, which is fine. There are some people who have been curious about the paradigm and are glad that there's somebody talking about it. But then there are also the odd few who are just kind of absolutely disgusted by the fact that I would even talk about these things seriously. But yeah, I was way more afraid of going into mystical circles because they kind of see it as you being divisive or you trying to pull the rug out from underneath them. And like a lot of people within this paradigm are people who need it for their health, their mental health, their kind of identity is built around it. A lot of them have been able to use a lot of these techniques to overcome things like drug addiction, to overcome things like depression. And by at all challenging that paradigm in any way, it kind of feels like you're pulling the rug out from underneath them in that way. So it kind of feels like being caught between Scylla and Charybdis in that regard.
So my experience was a little different. Like, you know, as I said, like, I found my greatest difficulties were being in anarchist circles. I still feel this. You know, I don't have a lot of like in life anarchist friends from the United States any longer. You know, now like here when I talk about mysticism, everyone's like fine with it, but I'm in a special region where, you know, it's not weird to talk about magic to Bretons who, you know, really haven't lost any of their old Breton traditions. You know, it's still there. But you know, even now, like, you know, I'll find that like if I write something and if it's something that is informed by my spirituality and does not meet leftist dogma, the usual reaction is not to dismiss me. The usual reaction is, you're a crypto fascist. You know, that's why you're into paganism, because you actually want to kill people. You actually want to do all of this. Like, and that, you know, that I think, you know, as somebody who's like specifically been in the streets fighting fascists, somebody who's written against fascism forever, like getting those attacks are always
jarring.
They're jarring, and it's always related to, you know, this, even if you get it from other spiritual people, it's the, you know, no, these things don't really have real consequences. Like, no, there's magic, but mostly we're just into witchcraft because it makes us feel good. Yes, you know, like it's great for, you know, feminism, like and feminist, like, you know, empowerment, but you're taking this a little too seriously. We think you're secretly a Nazi.
It's really very kind of unsettling when it comes to the lack of nuance when discussing these sorts of things. I feel like a lot of people have a very black and white worldview on both sides, and trying to it kind of feels like you're yelling at both sides as well, because you're like, no, you fucking annoying like neo-pagan, stop being like capitalist and like bourgeois about your shit. And then you're like, no, leftist, I'm not like some crypto fash crazy person who's like not, you know, please stop. It's like, but but I'm so happy that people like you and others are kind of occupying that ground. I think it's so important. Well, we'll move on to the next question now. And the next question is about egregores, which is one of the more fascinating concepts that you guys have spoken extensively about. And it really got me thinking about a lot of things. So if you would first like to explain to the audience what an egregore actually is, and then I'll get to the second half of my question.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I love talking about egregores. So first of all, egregore, it's a term that arose, I think it was Eliphas Levi who first mentioned it. The word actually means watcher, and it was used to describe spirits that were kind of solidified, kind of set patterns or you know, set thought forms that you know, could either be created or arose organically. It's the same thing that when people talk about zeitgeist, like the zeitgeist, or even, you know, let's say like the spirit of a city, like you know, like New York City's spirit or Chicago's spirit. What they're referring to is an egregore. It's the kind of coalesced thoughts, patterns, etc., that seems to take on a life of its own. And it takes on a life of its own in the way that you can see it best when you try to change it, when you try to challenge it. If you're hanging out in a group that has a specific egregore, or actually better yet, let's say like you're an American or you're British or French or whatever, you're subject to the egregore of that state. And when you try to do something that directly challenges the, you know, the spirit, the collective kind of idea of what it means to be American or English or French or whatever, you get really hard pushback. You know, you see this at times when the Egregores are strongest, when, you know, you have extreme nationalism. You know, if one were in Germany in 1939 trying to push against Germanness and say, no, I'm not a German, would have gotten you killed. That's kind of what an egregore is. There are lots of other examples of it. Communists came up with one. The worker is an egregore. It's kind of an archetype, but it's a created archetype. Where, okay, now we're all workers. We're now conforming to this identity of the worker. You look at Soviet propaganda, you know, all of the kind of sharp, muscular looking men and women who are all workers. Like they're symbols of the worker. It kind of took on a religious form. To go against that idea would be to attempt to kind of escape the egregore, to fight the egregore, but with so many people believing it, that egregore would be so powerful that you just can't. You know, you become an enemy of that egregore. You become an enemy of the state. You become an enemy of everybody around you. That, you know, those are examples of egregores. I hope that helps. It's
quite similar to Max Strino's idea about, I guess people are calling them spooks now, kind of the idea that somebody can become possessed by an ideology. So he's speaking in very kind of occult terms. And I think it's no accident that Max Strino has kind of become a little bit of a meme at the moment. He's become a little bit of a trendy kind of subject matter at the moment, especially when it comes to the idea of what he called spooks. The idea that, you know, us as individuals are kind of subject to these kind of almost metaphysical skins. And then it kind of got me thinking about the egregore of things like blackness or whiteness. Those are also those are egregores too. And then it kind of got me thinking in a wider context of countries, nationalities, even, you know, the egregore of political ideologies, even, you know, the egregore of, you know, America, for instance, which is something that we're seeing kind of having violent fits at the moment, if we're going to personify it. The next part of the question is, when it comes to the dangerous elements of the egregoric forces, what is the best way to combat them? I think it's a very useful frame in terms of what we're talking about when it comes to being absorbed and possessed by certain ideologies. How does one go about disengaging from that in a sort of metaphysical way?
So if we start with the idea that egregores exist, you know, and I'm glad you brought up spooks. It's really interesting. Stirner's, if I remember correctly, in the original German, it was Geist, you know, which is ghost, you know, and it translated as spook, and that just kind of stuck. But, you know, these are things that haunt. You know, you can kind of play with Derrida's idea on like hauntology as well, you know, or even just the fact that Marx called communism a specter haunting Europe.
Yeah, all this like spooky occult language that's being used, like
yeah.
It's pretty.
So the trick, I think, is to take control of those spooks or the egregore or the egregores. To challenge their meaning and actually, actually our T-shirt, I'm wearing it right now, says seize the means of the production of meaning. With communism and lots of anarchism, the idea is that like you need to seize the means of production. You have to take it back from the capitalists, and you have to make it your own. That like you're the one who's producing. Meaning is something that we also need to take back. These things are foisted upon us. These things are pushed on us. People become servants and slaves to ideologies, to spooks, to egregores. The thing is, when you acknowledge the thing false is not the right word. When you rise onto the level or look at things from like I called it the world without forms, or the world before forms, like all of these things are forms, and then when you step back for a second and you realize that all of these forms can be created, crafted, changed, and that the truly powerful, and I mean powerful in both a good and in a very bad way, the truly powerful movements that have occurred have always been when somebody seizes an egregore, creates it, shifts it, uses it for their own purpose. Jung kind of references this a bit in his Wotan essay, but the best example of a bad seizing of an egregore or bad creation of an egregore would be the Aryan race. The idea of Aryans before, like Aryan was a type of people who migrated from the area of Iran into India, way before it became a violent ideology where there was a master race. Like, that was never that in the original. But the Nazis were able to take this idea, imbue it with their own power and meaning, and then use that idea to wreak havoc upon the world and to slaughter millions of people. Worker, again, that's another way that an idea was imbued, was taken control of, in order to cause a revolution, the overthrow of the Tsar and the Russian Revolution. So combating it is maybe not the right word. I think taking control of them and shifting them away from the people who understand them. Like Hitler and the Nazis understood what was going on. They understood that they were creating something new that was meant to inhabit, to seize people. We can do the same thing for good. Like, instead of violence, instead of destruction, like, we can do the same thing. And I think you see that to some degree with meme culture, et cetera. Like, there are all kinds of ways of doing that. We need to do it more, and we need people who are more conscious of the effects of these memes as well, or these egregores, et cetera.
I definitely agree. It's something that I've talked about quite frequently on the channel. When we do get to the question about esoteric fascism, we'll talk more about it. But it's kind of a thing that I think, just like anything else, you need to be adept at. And if you're out of practice, it's pretty hard to be adept. Like I said in my last video about Jung and Peterson, I feel like, and also in your essay as well, which largely inspired a lot of what I was talking about, there's so much territory that we've abandoned as leftists, which then means that we're out of practice in areas where we should be adept. And unfortunately, the right wing has become adept in those forms. With magic, just like art or anything else, you can't just like pick up a paintbrush and make this Sistine Chapel happen. It takes practice, and in order to actually create something that will have the desired effect within the cultural zeitgeist, we have work to do. We have to get our paintbrushes out and start practicing. But
this is the left's fault. This is absolutely the left's fault. Like, anti-capitalists weren't allowed to do magic, and if you were doing magic, you were a fascist. We weren't allowed to, talk to gods. We weren't allowed to talk to spirits. We weren't allowed to bring any of that sort of stuff up. And at the same time, indigenous people who were talking about their gods and their spirits and their traditions and their magic, when they were like, even when people were praying at Standing Rock, there were people saying, oh, well, that's like really nice, but we need to do something. And the people gathered there like, this is what we are doing. This is our magic. We're on our land. We are, this is our resistance. Our magicians are shit. like our meaning makers are shit. We're awful. We're not good at this
Yes.
because we weren't allowed to do this.
Yeah.
And we have a handful of people who are learning to do this, and they're making some mistakes here and there, but for the most part, they're doing an incredible job.
Yeah.
And we have a lot more people, and we have to catch up. Like,
Yeah.
and
My definition of magic anyway is like being able to affect your own consciousness and also being able to affect other people's consciousnesses. So in that sense, what we are doing right now is a form of magic. Writing and disseminating information is a form of magic. There's talking to gods and spirits is also a form of magic. There are so many different levels where we need like adept people to take control of those domains. But it's difficult, like you said, because we're just kind of trying to start the engine up that's like running on E, and it's something that is going to take time. But the thing that frightens me the most is I don't know if we have time. That's the thing that like fucks me up.
we don't have time to stop the empire from crumbling. It's falling. We don't have time to stop. We can't stop what's happening, but we do have time to control how things fall and where we're standing when things collapse around us. I think I've seen a lot of leftists in the last few years start to transition away from organizing and mass organized resistance towards building sustained, resilient, protected communities. I think both are necessary. I think we definitely still need the organizers. But the thing that I think is really, like some of us are just giving up doesn't mean no longer fighting. Giving up means, okay, this is all falling apart. I'm going to go plant a garden now and talk to some of my friends and see if they want to help me with this garden, and we can make a good garden. So when everything falls apart, we can eat, and that, I think, unfortunately, like, so is the far right. The far right are actually a little bit better right now at building like alternative communities as well. You see, like permaculture communities, they tend to have a lot of far right people in them now, because everyone realizes, all right, everything's falling apart. It's time for us to find a safe place to stay, and to build something that where we can survive.
Yeah. It's super interesting because I know that Ernest Haeckel is he was like one of the founders of the ecology movement, and he was an esoteric fascist. And it's so annoying how they tend to have their fingers on the quote unquote zeitgeist. They have like such an understanding of the egregoric force that we just kind of like put our blinders on, and like it really annoys me. I don't know, it just kind of pisses me off.
That was so, the way, like, before that, the Vondervolgen, and a lot of other, most of these resistance movements in Berlin, like an ex-partner of mine, he did his master's thesis on occult and sexuality in Weimar, Berlin, just before the Nazis kind of took over. If you look at what these people were building at that point, and then you look at what happened when the Nazis took over, the Nazis mostly just stole a lot of the ideas. But they were able to steal them because the leftists at the time, majority communists, but also anarchist groups, were so obsessed over taking over the factories. The whole idea is like, we're going to build this, while they're trying to build the Aryan race, we're going to try to build the worker race. We're going to take over the factories. We're going to seize these means of production, and all of these occult people with these people who are switching genders and all of that stuff. they're immature. They don't know what's going on.
Mm.
So those communities
It
would.
reminds,
I'm
it
sorry.
reminds it reminds me a little bit of the video I did on Dadaism, and how there was that huge split in Zurich at the time between the art, you know, the surrealist Dadaist left and the kind of communist party. And the thing about the Dadaists, a lot of them were occultists. Andre Breton was like a huge occultist. Like so many of them were like super steeped within this occult paradigm. And they believed that to neglect the subjective needs of man would only serve to kind of create new forms of alienation. I mean, Andre Breton even said that any mistake in interpreting the condition of man is a mistake in interpreting the conditions of the universe, and therefore a hindrance to its transformation. So in that sense, he was talking some hermeticism right there, that so as above, so below kind of thing. And he got it, like he understood, and they just wouldn't listen. And it's like, how the fuck do we make people listen? Like it's just, I don't know.
I don't think we can, but I think, you know, one, we have to move beyond the idea that we're gonna, you know, have a completely materialist. I mean, we need to get beyond the idea that materialism just means money, you know, and just means like the you know, literal physical conditions. Like, you know, materialism was like the, you know, let's look at these conditions, but like, you know, Marx, even though Marx called religion the opiate and the masses in like one section, and like in other sections, he's like, religion like is part of like the human condition, like the, you know, the reason why they're doing this, they need to do this, you know, but we don't, you know, right now, like you don't see many people doing that, and the few of us who are, you know, are still scattered, we're still isolated. Half of the left thinks that we're secretly fascist and want us to shut up, you know, and then the half of the spiritual communities that we're part of, like, you know, think we're Marxist demagogues and need to shut up, you know.
Yeah.
Where does it go from here? I don't know, but
I don't know either. I don't know. It's just I guess we just have to keep kind of doing what we're doing and just kind of hope, and also prepare to kind of have systems that can aid us through the crumble of empire. Like you said, like, you know, I'm quite on your side, because I know that you guys have this really wonderful podcast called Empires Crumble. Everybody go and check it out because it's fucking amazing. There was this one episode where you were talking about the resistor witches, you know, these witches who are going to like appeal to the Statue of Liberty to save, you know, American empire and hegemony. All the kind of resistance magic that they're doing is based around kind of trying to preserve the already crumbling egregore. And like, I'm with you 100% in the sense that we need to let it crumble, and we need to start thinking about alternative models, alternative ways of being in that regard. But at the same time, the reason why people are afraid is because it sounds like an accelerationist point of view. You know, the amount of human suffering that is going to occur within the empire crumbling is also a factor that we have to keep in mind. But like, I remember there's this really wonderful Yoruba priestess that I follow, and she was talking about how the role of the magician or the priestess is to kind of be the midwife for life, for birth and for death. So you can't really be afraid of any of those things if you're putting yourself in this sort of shamanic position, especially at this time of history where things are so precarious. You have to be able to sort of look at it all. But at the same time, I wouldn't necessarily. Oh, sorry, go on.
Oh, I was gonna say it's an awful reality, and I understand why people. You know, I think that's like where I personally tend to get the most pushback. And you know, it's as if I am declaring a death sentence on trans people and disabled people and immigrants and people of color everywhere by saying that these things are happening. And the problem is, like, I'm not, it's not my death. I intend to, and this is a good way of putting it, like, you know, let empire crumble, push out some of the supports whenever you can. But while you're doing it, make sure you get everybody that you care about who is going to be the most hurt by this out of the way of the falling rocks. You know, like our goal is to, well, in our role, I guess, is to know that this is happening and to build structures immediately, like communities, networks, etc., so that everybody, the most vulnerable amongst us, the people who are going to be the most harmed by this stuff, who in every single case have had the least amount of influence on climate change, etc. You know, they're not the wealthy, they're not the people who have been doing these things. It's our role to to get them to safety whenever we can, you know. But we can't sugarcoat the fact that, you know, until we acknowledge this is happening, we can't help anybody, you know. And to say, hey, if, you know, the house is on fire and someone says, hey, I need my respirator, like I can't leave the house without my respirator, it's like, okay, cool, let me grab your respirator and get you out. But that doesn't change the fact that someone needs to get out of the house, you know, when it's burning or anything else like that. And I understand why it's difficult. It's scary, you know, it's terrifying.
Again, it's that kind of split between my left brain, right brain, Angie. Left brain is like, we need to, you know, try and at least try to do something because, you know, there's so much at stake. But then right brain is like, empires crumble all the time in history. You know, we can't really do much about, you know, what is happening because I'm not the sort of person that has a huge effect on those things. But at the same time, it's difficult because I don't know where I stand on it. Because part of me feels like it sounds like accelerationism. The other half of me totally understands where you're coming from and like kind of resonates. It's difficult. It is definitely a difficult thing. It's definitely a difficult thing to unpick. But I do totally kind of get it. It's just the fear of what will come that is the paralyzing factor, I think, for most people, including myself.
I mean, I just look at, like, you know, when Rome fell, well, not we, but, you know, in general, like, it's looked at, it's the start of a dark ages where everything was misery and horror, and Europe was just, it went backwards, it became primitive, etc. But the thing is, if you were to ask, I think, every single one of the Roman slaves who were freed when Rome fell because their masters could no longer hold on to them any longer, if you were to ask them what the fall of the Roman Empire meant, and if you were to ask them, hey, was this a dark ages for you? They're probably going to say, oh, no, this was the best day of my life. You know, I escaped and I was able to find land and able to support myself and not having to worry about all of these Roman citizens telling me what to do and not to do. So for those of us, and not me, but like, if you look at all of the people who right now are suffering under this empire, you know, and you tell them this empire is going to end, most of them are going to be like, okay, cool.
Yeah. You know? It's one of those things that is somewhat speculative, but I definitely understand what you're getting at, definitely. So we'll move on to the next question, which is I think this is the Esoteric Fascism. Oh yes. So practical ways that us magical leftists can, you know, use magic in resistance terms. Like I mentioned, there's a lot of ham-fisted attempts going on at the moment. Attempts that don't necessarily involve a real understanding of like the egregores and, you know, what's going on and our place kind of within this, you know, ecosystem and our role and stuff. And then there's also some good things happening at the same time. So what do you think are some practical ways that we can, you know, push those of us who are magical people can, you know, use magic as a tool for resistance?
Yeah. I would start by first saying that you know, one of the four pillars of witchcraft, as it were, and this is a relatively new idea, but if you look at the way that you know, spirituality and witchcraft, etc., was practiced in the Middle Ages, there was a cult of secrecy around it, you know, and if you look at even in Rome, like, you know, these were mysteries, they were secret traditions, etc. I think the very first thing that we can learn from and use from all of that stuff is learning to shut the fuck up.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right now in the United States, there's a big thing about you know, public hexing, which, you know, it's great to hex the fuck out of these people, please, but there's a lot of personalities involved who are, you know, trying to, you know, mostly they're trying to, like, you know, sell their own products.
Getting clout. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Yeah,
Like,
and
I said
they're
trying to clout chase.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, like a lot of the secret kind of, not secret, but the, you know, security culture that anarchists have always had. You know, that parallels the secret, you know, the traditions of secrecy in occult groups, and you know, as I said in that about that book, the occult features of anarchism, secrecy came from these anarchists being in these secret societies at the same time and learning, all right, you know, we infiltrate these structures, we use them, we keep our real activities secret, you know, until we strike. You know, one phrase that came to me in a dream, actually it was another person's dream that they told me about, was cover your blades in ash and wait. You know, why cover your blade in ash? Because it doesn't glint in the moonlight. You strike when you can see, but they can't see you. So before we even talk about the, you know, the magical sort of stuff, those are the things that, you know, we all give our lives away on our phones all of the time. We post everything about everything we're doing all of the time. We let Facebook and Google, like, you know, check in for us, etc. We don't hide anything about ourselves. We all need to learn to become secret again. We need to learn to you know, like, build in-person communities, not rely on the internet to work these works, these magics, you know, etc. Be that a nighttime strike on a factory, or be that a nighttime strike in a group of witches, you know. Peter Gray, who I love to pieces, I'm not sure if you're aware of him or not, but he wrote Apocalyptic Witchcraft. He pointed out that, you know, the Sabbath could only operate because it was secret. You know, the you could do these things together because of the secrecy, which is do things in secret and at nighttime on purpose. Okay, so that was, you know, that was the beginning. But, like, what kind of magic? Like, you know, I could probably give like a couple of principles. One, I'm gonna do a plug for this because I know, you know, it's likely, you know, many of your listeners or viewers don't believe in gods, don't believe in spirits, etc., like that. So this isn't for them, you know. And I know even a lot of occultists don't truck with gods at all. They don't have anything to do with gods. Gods are a really easy way to tap into a lot of magic. You have to talk to them though, and you have to make deals with them. You have to say, hey, I'll do this for you if you can do this for me, etc. And you have to kind of operate on their goals the same way that you would have to operate with, you know, a rival trade union when you're trying to do a strike. You know, so that's one of the things. I saw in the chat that someone mentioned Gritty. Gritty is an NHL mascot that anti-fascists have adopted. And yeah, he's got this terrifying glance, and he looks like one of Loki's children.
Oh wow.
He's just this horrifying thing, but also is kind of smiling, but smiling with this like evil grin. And as I said, American anti-fascists have adopted him. There's something you can do right there. Not just making him a meme, not just using him all of the time, but like I said, he looks like one of Loki's children. Loki spawned all kinds of really hideous, awful things that were necessary for the world and necessary to destroy orders that needed to be destroyed, destroy civilizations, societies that needed to be undermined, etc. You know, right there, you know, the esoteric fascists, the alt-right, you know, they had Pepe the Frog or whatever, who was also, you know, to some extent keck. Gritty can become the exact same thing. You know, there's one. There's a lot of other things like that. You know, the principles I would suggest is, one, make sure you know your shit. You know, a lot of people now coming into magic, you know, learned about it on Tumblr. You know, awesome, great. You know, that's a very good thing. But there's a lot of divination. There's a lot of self work that's required to be able to actually operate magic. You know.
I've tried before in a lot of different ways and fallen flat on my ass. So yeah, definitely.
Well, here's the thing, like, you know, if you use Crowley's formulation, I think it was Crowley. I tried never to bring up Crowley because I don't like him. But you know, the whole idea of, like, you know, conforming the world to your will. If you don't know what your will is, then attempting to conform the world to it will only cause you harm. You know, at the best, it will do nothing, and at the worst, it will cause you repeated harm. If you don't know what you actually want, and if you don't know why you want those things, good example, like trying to do magic to get a new car that you saw. You know, and it's like, I really want that car, without actually ever asking, why do I want a car? Why do I want that car? Where did that come from? Oh, that came from advertising. So that means that isn't actually my will. Someone infused that into me. So that's like the principles behind magic, the principles behind witchcraft, of all of the self work. It's the boring stuff. It's the stuff that seems kind of quasi religious or you know, a little too new agey. Although new agers don't really do a whole lot of self work anyway. But that, I think, before anything else, is what is needed. The, you know, plumbing the depths of your soul, of your psyche. Like, why do I feel this way? Why do I even want to change the world? Why do I want to end fascism? Why do I want to end capitalism? If you don't know those things, then you can't work any magic to actually do it. You know, worst case scenario, like, you'll harm yourself a whole lot. And then the other thing is, you know, I'm a quote unquote solitary practitioner or whatever. I operate by myself, and most witches all operate by themselves. But at some point, you have to work with other people. It's the same way with, you know, lone wolf anarchism or whatever, where you're just like, I'm going to do a one-man revolution. You can't do a one-man revolution. You need other people to help you.
Yeah.
You know, the trick there too, of course, is the one man, because it's usually the men who want to just do it all themselves. You know, I don't need anybody else. We need each other, because we are trying to build a new world, and you can't build it alone. And those other people are going to be the ones that you want to spend your life in that new world with. And so finding other people who know magic, who have similar goals, and working in non-hierarchical relationship with them, where you're teaching each other instead of, oh, I'm the teacher, or this is like, the elder who teaches us everything, and we just do what she or he says.
Mm.
That's not the way to go. Like you have to basically build covens, and they don't have to be covens. Like, they could be guilds, like alliances, like whatever you want to call them.
Mm.
But working with other people is, that's the key to doing magic that sticks, magic that will stick,
Yeah.
magic that will keep repeating
Yeah.
itself. One person can't
Yeah.
create an egregore. Hitler could not create the Aryan race alone.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Do it. So I hope that helps. Like,
Exactly.
I don't have any recipes. I don't have any spells. I don't.
No. I was more thinking principles. But yeah, I'm so happy that you said what you said, because it's exactly what I think. And I also think it's important to point out that like everybody has strengths and weaknesses, innate strengths and weaknesses. And I think it's important to like focus on strengths. Like for me, I have a pretty strong intuition. That's always kind of been a gift of mine. But I'm really terrible when it comes to practicalities. So there are certain areas where I'm like not very useful, certain areas where I am very useful. Like my the way that I express magic is through art. And also, if we're gonna get a little bit more mystical and woo-woo, I like to mess around with the collective unconscious and like the zeitgeist. I kind of see it as like a real place that I go to like find concepts and stuff. So there's a lot of ritual and stuff around that. So I'm a little bit of a psychonaut in that regard. I like to go off world. Um, there's also so many different areas that people are adept at. It's not like there's not a whole of dogma or one size fits all. Like whatever it is that is what you can give, and nobody should be able to pressure you out or into anything that you're not necessarily comfortable with. But in terms of magic as a tool for resistance, I think those are definitely good areas to start. Secrecy, number one, super important. I don't understand why people feel the need to it's quite a new phenomenon, actually. I don't get why people feel the need to broadcast things constantly.
Social
And
capital.
also I think that, yeah, social capital. But even then, how much social capital are you going to get from telling people that you've been hexing someone? I mean, I think most people think that it's a crazy thing, which is why it's so like perplexing to me. So the other question I wanted to ask is kind of an offshoot of this question, is about hexing, actually, because I don't think a lot of people understand the principles behind hexing or what hexing really is.
Mm-hmm.
What would you like to kind of explain from your perspective, and then I'll explain from my perspective?
Yeah, so let's take this out of the magic, or what everyone thinks of magic at the moment, and look at the old Irish bardic tradition of they didn't even call it casting, but it was the Glam Disen, I believe.
Mm.
Bards were powerful, and bards were feared by the kings of Ireland, because a bard could tell or make a statement about a king, or about the reality of the world, and change that reality for the people. There are all kinds of examples of this, but
Or they could write a song that was mocking of somebody, and that would literally last for centuries, generations. There are even some bardic kind of insults that we still use today to like kind of mar somebody's name. So if the bard was to write a song about you, you were pretty much fucked for eternity in that regard.
The best bards could have those songs created and not even have their name on it, so that everyone felt as if it was coming from the people. That everything about hexing is kind of contained in that story. Now, there are hexes that operate completely on the social level. The problem is we have this false dichotomy between what is the social level and what is the magical level. Like the being able to change the history of an entire island by a song, that's magic. you know? But, you know, we tend to say, oh, well, you know, that was a song that was a different effect from what like magic is, you know, whatever. It's like, no, that was magic. Like the bards looked at what they were doing as magical. The kings looked at what they were doing as magical. So that's what hexing is. Hexing is being able to influence somebody, to harm them, to change, you know, their status, their reputation, their health, their physical conditions from a distance by the utterance or the actions of, you know, a ritual of some sort. You know, and that could be, you know, another example from Ireland. There was a May Day tradition on Beltane of planting an egg in the field of your landlord. You could only do it on Beltane, but if you did it on Beltane, you planted the egg, their crops would wither, and so your landlord had no food anymore, had no money, wasn't able to make any money, had to lose his property. You took it over. You know, that is another kind of form of hexing. How the egg was able to do that, there's actually a long Druidic explanation for that, but that's another example of hexing. On that same level, you know, and I really insist that our understanding of magic needs to kind of expand a little bit. The saboteurs, the people who are throwing their sabots, their wooden shoes into the looms in factories in France. They were hexing that factory. They broke that factory by throwing in their shoes, destroyed everything. That is also a sort of hexing.
Definitely. I feel like yeah, the definitions need to be expanded, specifically because a lot of what we're seeing kind of floating around social media is specifically linked to this kind of cartoonish, occulty, like witches gathering in a circle, you know, slaughtering chickens and stuff form of hexing, whereas there are a million different ways to do it. But the thing about hexing is it takes a shit ton of effort to do actual hex. And a lot of these people wouldn't be able to kind of hex the feathers off a chicken if they tried. It's tremendous amount of effort to do. There's a time and place for it. And I personally think that you shouldn't hex somebody unless you are willing to be punished in the same way for the same action. So if you're going to hex someone for gossiping, then you better not fucking gossip, basically. I feel like there's a lot of confusion around like its purpose, what it means, what it's for. And I think that a lot of it is just theatrics. But even then, the theatrics can also have a psychological effect on the intended party. I remember, again, grandmother, all my grandmother's stories, she would tell me about how whenever somebody was trying to do you ill in the village, or you had a suspicion that they were trying to do you ill, you would take an item off of their like clothing thingy, their like washing line, and then go to the home of the witch doctor. Even though you might not actually be doing anything ill towards them, the mere fact that you've planted that seed in their consciousness is what will fuck.
Oh yeah. No, I've seen some people utterly convinced, oh my God, I'm being hexed, just because somebody made some statement, even online, like, oh yeah, you know, I just bought a cow's tongue today, you know, and that was enough to convince them. I fear I've lost you. Hello?
Wait, what? Waiting to join call. I'm back. I'm back. Hi.
Hello.
I'm so sorry about that.
No,
I'm so sorry about that. It's like whatever is gonna go wrong will fucking go wrong. I think we're still on air now, right?
yeah, it
We
appears.
should be. Yeah, we're live. Okay. Okay, wonderful. We're talking about hexing.
Sorry. So where were we? I'm sorry.
We were talking about hexing.
Oh yeah. That was perfect timing for that to go out.
Yeah,
But
for the
actually,
fucking shit to crash.
you know,
Jesus Christ.
I really had to pee, so that worked perfectly.
Okay.
I think you were about to talk about hexing. You had just started talking about the the way that it's kind of comical, but then you had also brought up the story that your grandmother had said about all you had to do was just go to the witch doctor as with the other person seeing.
Yeah, basically, it's kind of like the psychological effect that can have on someone. And I was saying that it's incredibly difficult to hex somebody. There's a time and a place for it, so it's not something that you just kind of do willy-nilly out of whim. You have to have intent behind it, and also you probably shouldn't hex somebody for something that you do yourself. So like, if you're gonna gossip, if you're a gossiper and you're gonna hex someone for gossiping, then you probably shouldn't gossip. I feel like there's a lot of confusion in culture around what hexing actually is and the effect that it has, and also why people decide to go and do it. And I think that if you're confused about it, I think thinking about the bardic model is definitely a useful tool in that regard.
I think too. So my experience, I want to say limited, but maybe it's not all that limited. But my experience in hexing has been that to some degree you tie your fate to the other person.
Wow.
But again, this is the same thing that happens in all of the social forms as well. When you contest with somebody by spreading a rumor to cause them to lose reputation, or even like when someone tries to steal somebody else's social capital by waging an internet crusade with them, you're tying your fate to theirs to some degree. With my experiences with magic, you're doing that as well, and so we could use the Jungian shadow sort of thing to some extent. If you are doing this because you hate something about them, it's pretty likely that you are responding to your shadow. Like that something about them is actually something about you, and you could cause yourself to have what we call crossed conditions very severely, where you're harming yourself at the same time that you're harming them, and actually possibly even harming yourself more. So again, going back to knowing yourself when you initiate these things is essential. You can't just say, "Oh, I'm gonna hex Trump." Like, honestly, hexing Trump and binding Trump is the dumbest idea ever.
I know. I know.
And here's the thing, from a magical perspective, like, we don't have enough witches to counteract the millions of Christians praying for that fucker, and I am a polytheist. I'm an animist. I believe in lots of gods. I also believe the Christian God exists, and they are fucking doing magic when they're all praying. And you look at, like, even the most boring Protestant Christian rituals, like, there's magic involved. And when you have all of these people actively praying for somebody, and you're like, "Hey, everybody, I'm gonna hex Trump," like, don't get in a war with them. Know your history. Like, have like some sense of like, oh yeah, those people hunted my kind down and killed us and pulled our bowels out. Like, and there's all these paintings that will show what it was like. It's a bad idea. Yeah, there are other people that'd be a lot easier to hex because no one's praying for them. Go for them. you know?
Yeah, yeah, that's true. That's very true. I feel like, you know, people need to really kind of pay attention to it as if it's a practical thing, because it is a practical thing. Even though it's in the realm of things that are not necessarily seen as being within consensus reality, there are practical laws and things operating behind all of these concepts, which is something I think people should be paying more attention to. But moving on to the next question. So I did a video about esoteric fascism, and I know quite a few times
That
in
was an
this stream
awesome
you have
video.
mentioned. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Yeah, I was. It's something that has been like super heavy in my consciousness for a really long time. Kind of almost a morbid fascination with this area of study. I wanted to ask you about your ideas about esoteric fascism. I know that you've mentioned that you've been accused of being fascist specifically because you work within the realm of esotericism. Why is it that you think the right wing has had such a profound effect within this domain? And why do you think that a lot of people who are far right are attracted to this domain and have had a massive impact in this domain? I know that one of the things that people talk about is people like Crowley or Blavatsky, people who kind of had elements of fascism floating around in their ideology. What is the link, basically, in the collective unconscious there, if it's possible to even diagnose?
So I believe that, you know, we talked about this already. I believe that the, you know, it's through occult means that new worlds are created. And we underestimate the far right and the esoteric fascists if we believe that they're just in this because they hate. You know, most of them are pretty fucking hateful. But they're not just in it because they hate. They want to make a world. They want to create the world in their image. And they gravitate towards the occult because that's how you do it. You know, like that is the means by which you can, you know, again going back to the Nazi project, and you know the Nazis didn't use the swastika just because they thought it was a cool symbol, you know, just because they thought it was like pretty. They used it because it had power. um the In my experience, and I've spent a lot of time, you know, I'm like you, I can seem kind of obsessed with them, but the reason why I do that is because I look at their stuff and I'm like, hey, you stole that. I want it back. You know, like
Mm-hmm.
you can't have that shit. That's ours, you know? And
Mm-hmm.
so I've spent a lot of time reading, you know, like Countercurrents and a couple of other websites where you see a lot of the esoteric fascists post stuff or mention writers, and oftentimes they mention writers that and occultists who weren't fascist at all, you know, who would have been mortified at being associated with any of these things, and they say, hey, look, you know, we can use this, we can use that. They are unabashed in it. They don't
Mm-hmm.
have qualms about using these things.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we do, and
Why do you think there's less pushback on that end than there is here? Because the thing that annoys me the most is that, like, it clearly has had an effect, and like, why would we, like, I don't understand are we more married to secularism than they are? Are they more likely to, you know, be open to certain ideas? Like, I just don't understand, because if you see something as clearly having an effect and you know, managing to sort of you know, basically ram its way into the cultural zeitgeist, you know, even if it's something that you despise or you don't like, I think it's important to at least look at the methods and take those methods seriously. I don't know. It's just very confusing to me. I don't know if I'm articulating my anger in the correct way.
no, I totally agree with you. And you know, if this makes sense, like the left kind of came up with this idea of collective action that is explicitly anti-hierarchical, but is implicitly hierarchical. You know, if you look at any anarchist group, the ones who are most committed to anti-hierarchy, like to being non-hierarchical, being horizontal, there is always someone who's leading, you know, and they're leading by charisma, you know, or they're leading by resources, or just leading by time. You know, there's the person who's there, like setting up the meetings, turning on the lights, turning off the lights. You know, they're kind of leading. They're kind of like the ones that tend to be in charge, like the people who show up tend to be in charge. So when we said we wanted to create a non-hierarchical, anti-hierarchical, equal society, we still never really interrogated what power is and how it works out. This, you know, we talked about Stirner before. Stirner, I think, is probably one of the most essential like reintroductions into leftism right now, because Stirner, he's collectivist, but actually anti-collectivist at the same time, and that's because he demands that every single person embrace their own ideological sorry, not ideological, but their own unique individual power and be responsible fully for themselves. So, but we still haven't really kind of figured that out on the left. But on the right has the idea of the, you know, they've taken Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch and they've run with it and perverted it into these horrifying ways where, you know, these people who you know, are just like, I can do whatever I want. I can use whatever I want. I'm gonna take from this tradition and that tradition and this magic and that magic, and I'm gonna cobble something together, and it is going to give me power. It is going to give me power over people, and I'm going to change the world with that. You know, kind of the Crowleyan idea. The right is totally okay with that, whereas the left is like, oh well, we're all non-hierarchical, but yeah, you know, that dude who's always talking all of the time, like he definitely, you know, no one wants to piss him off, you know. So we have
someone in the chat just said that they think that you're confusing hierarchy with leadership. Yeah.
Well,
Do you
so I would say it's not that I'm doing that. It's that I believe that's what the left does. Because, you know, to some degree, you know, I've seen some feminists particularly interrogate the idea of anti-hierarchy by saying, hey, look, there is always someone exerting dominance over someone else. And until people accept the idea that there are people who are going to be leading in non-hierarchical groups, they're always going to end up replicating these systems of dominance. You know, so, you know, they have a kind of a point that's the problem, that like there's a confusion there. But the right has no qualms on any of that. You know, the person who comes up with the power first and, like, you know, the thing that's gonna give everyone power and weapons and reputation or whatever, you know, they're lauded. Whereas on the left, we're like, you know, oh no, we shouldn't be doing any of that. We need to build an equal society, and no, we can't do guns, and we can't do any of these things, and no, let's not like be too mean to the boss, you know. So yeah, I think there's a little bit of the Ward Churchill called it like nonviolence as pathology. I think you know, where we've just, you know, taken this idea that you know, we've become cowards and fail to embrace our own power. And part of that power is the magic, is the meaning creation that the far right esoteric fascists have no qualms in using, and they're really good at it. They've got practice.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, for one, I think that one of the best ways to combat esoteric fascism is, number one, to understand it and to not dismiss it as, you know, the delusions of paranoid fantasists. I think that we need to put more attention into understanding it, regardless of what your belief system or paradigm is. It's good to have some form of understanding of what's going on. And secondly, I think we really have to reclaim territory. That's the second most important thing when it comes to combating esoteric fascists, because I feel like on the left we've really neglected the internal landscape and we've left it to the right wing, like, you know, that they're using its faculties and its tools to create ill in the world. They're affecting culture and psychology in a way that's really, really detrimental. I mean, I'm like, my last live stream I did mention taking it out of like the magical realm to the more secular psychological realm, for instance, even though they're pretty much one and the same, even though most people won't necessarily see it, but the principles that psychologists deal with are the same things that like shamans deal with. So it's kind of, but in a different framing / context.
Well, they both really
taking
deal
it back
with
to,
which is the soul. You
yeah,
know,
yeah,
the word psyche was the soul. Like, so yeah, you're right.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, but when I'm talking about the internal landscape, that's very, very much what I'm talking about. And yeah, like I feel like, you know, I was talking about it in my last live stream, like for instance, with like young men and things like that, a lot of the information that is being offered to them to help them combat things like alienation, lack of self-esteem, kind of building themselves as people and individuating in the Jungian sense, it's all being offered by reactionaries. Because for my Jordan Peterson and Jung video, I had to really do a lot of research and, you know, look at what resources were being offered to, you know, depressed and alienated young men. And the majority of what I found was heavily, heavily, heavily reactionary. So by us abandoning these domains and not doing the work, whether you want to view it as psychological, esoteric, whatever the fuck, it's insane that we would leave this crucial territory, you know, to the wind. It doesn't make sense to me at all. So I think when it comes to combating esoteric fascism, you know, one of the important things we have to look at is like, even though they may be our enemies, they're not always 100% wrong. The fact that they talk about, you know, and cater to those the alienation that modern life creates, the fact that they're actually offering some sort of cohesive worldview, even though it may be false and wrong and dangerous, the fact that there's a sense of history and community and camaraderie, even though it's mostly just an illusion, these are the things that are really making them gain cultural ground that we've been losing for the past 100 years. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a hard tightrope to walk because, you know, even, you know, you mentioned earlier in this that you know, we've all become very black and white. It is, we are absolutely this or we are absolutely that. And if anybody appears to give any ground to an opposing argument, they're therefore, you know, they are therefore supporting that argument or whatever. The few who do openly challenge the far right's ideas, and by challenging I mean, you know, what you've done, looking at them and dismantling them, finding out where they come from, you know, what parts of that are truth, how that truth operates as the sugar coating on a poison pill.
Yeah.
You know, there are a few people doing that, and usually when they do that, they get destroyed online. You know, they
Yeah.
get attacked. You know, they. To be honest, I think, you know, and this is, you see this particularly with American anti-fascism right now. Like, the same amount of effort will be thrown at somebody who says, hey, here's why someone like Jack Donovan or Richard Spencer is able to get so many people. And if you did not say, it's because they're all hateful people who hate these people and they need to die, they're all evil, you know, they will spend the same amount of time attacking that person as they would the person that, you know, is actually the fascist. I don't know how to get out of that, but it is such a needed work, you know.
Yeah.
And
For sure.
you know, I've
For
kind of
sure.
accepted that it's sort of my lot in life that, you know, I'm always going to be a lightning rod for that now, where, you know, there's always going to be accusations like, oh, you know, he said he was, or he's a fascist because he said that, you know, like men aren't inherently evil, or you know, whatever. It's just stuff like that. It gets really wild, and at the same time you see these far right movements get bigger and bigger and bigger, and no one, you know, the only answer is a fist, but we don't have enough fists to fight them, you know.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and
Unless
like,
we really get our shit together, unless we actually do the work and we actually get our shit together, you know, and we actually like take these things seriously, then we're kind of not going to be equipped to really make a huge difference in that regard. I think it's because my Jordan Peterson video, there were a few lobster boys, but there weren't as many as I was expecting. Yeah, there weren't as many as I was expecting, you know. I tend not to get a whole lot of shit from reactionaries. I don't know why, because I've ever since I started the channel, I've been kind of waiting for the onslaught. Maybe it's because I'm not big enough yet to be a problem. That could definitely be it. But I've not, even when I made videos about esoteric fascism, even when I've made videos about actual fascism and actually called people by name, I've not really received much of a pushback in terms of that. But I don't know if that's just because I'm not, my what I'm doing is like pretty obscure at the moment. But like
they don't have the attention
back
span
to
to
your
video.
maybe
You know what I mean?
maybe that's what it is.
Ali and I noticed this when we started our podcast. Like, you know, we don't get the same sorts of attacks that we did when we would just write these things, but it's because, you know, no one's going to listen to an hour and 20 minutes just to find something that they can hate on. You know, that's a huge investment of time. People just want to click on something real quick. So
It's true. I mean, it's kind of interesting what you're saying, but like specifically when it comes to like esoteric fascism, I think that you're super like accurate in a sense that on the left we kind of eat each other around this issue. Like we really do eat each other, and I think acknowledging the areas where they have their fingers on elements that we have not been paying attention to is really important. Like I know that a lot of leftists that are the new leftists, the baby leftists, including myself, came from this sort of liberal paradigm. I wasn't always leftist. I'm only 20, but I'm going to be 25 in February, so I'm only just starting to sort of form. How, say that again?
Aquarius or Pisces?
Aquarius.
Wait, sorry.
Yeah, are you an Aquarius?
When's your birthday?
The 4th of February.
I'm the 14th.
Oh my god! Fellow Aquarius. Yay. I love meeting other Aquariuses. Isn't the 14th Valentine's Day?
It is indeed, yes.
Oh wow. That's a really lucky birthday. That's really
I was born on the day of a beheaded saint, and I worship a beheaded god, so it kind of works out pretty well.
Wow. I love that. I love that. That's really amazing. But yeah, as I was saying, yeah, it's crazy how like, yeah, I'm 25 in a couple months. I'm only just starting to form a worldview. But as a young kid / teenager, I was a liberal, and there's a sense of smug, and a lot of people are just kind of coming out of that liberal paradigm, and there's this sense of smugness there that, you know, we have all the answers. And I think that all that's unfolded in the last kind of you know, 3 to 4 years has been a massive slap in the face to show, no, we don't. Because for a while back there, I think people were really convinced on the whole Fukuyamaist end of history thing. They really didn't think the right wing would gain any major ground. And like, we received a rude fucking awakening. And I think we need to get beyond that shock and actually start looking at the methods that they use to achieve those cultural ends. I really don't understand why it's so difficult for people to actually look. And like, even someone like Jordan Peterson, for instance, what we're talking about here on this, it's not obscure by any standards. There's somebody who's literally being hailed as the greatest intellectual of the 21st century, who's talking about fucking mysticism and Jung. And all of you are just kind of sitting there, like fucking twiddling your fucking fingers. Like, why won't you fucking wake up? It's really annoying. I don't know. I need to stop because I'm gonna go.
I'm with you there. I'm with you there. I saw this like when Milo, and I can never pronounce his last name, so I'm not going to try. But when Milo was a big thing, and everybody was dismissing Milo as just being like an idiot, and I'd watched what he was doing, and I'm like, no, this guy's really brilliant. And the problem is like he's riding this wave of frustration with online created um, identity politics, which the identity politics online are utterly different from like the identity politics in real life. Like online, you can call yourself whatever you want and have entire communities that are just like devoted to that. And people getting frustrated with that. He rode that to a lot of money. And, and those of us who are watching him that were like, no, this guy's smarter than you're acting, or smarter than you think. You need to take this guy seriously. You need to fight him. It took a long time for people to actually take that threat seriously. And it's the same way with Jordan Peterson. I think people just think that if they write enough like kind of ho-hummy like think pieces about, I'm sorry,
I said if they write enough scathing op-eds, he'll just kind of crawl away.
Oh no, he feeds off of that every single time. Like the liberal like Jewish media that what he calls the liberal Jewish media, that sort of thing. Whenever the exact same people that people like Jordan Peterson are attacking and smearing write something bad about him, it just feeds back into him. Like he's just so good. Trump is the same way. Like Trump was able to take every single criticism of him and wear it like armor. These people are brilliant. They're
very savvy. They're very, very savvy. They're very savvy in terms of like the practical element of like amassing and gaining political power. They're very savvy in terms of using mythological language, things that appeal to the things within the collective unconscious. But the thing is, once they get the power, historically, they've not really known what to do with it. They're very good at getting power, but then when it comes to like actually like maintaining the power, it's like a struggle. So I think that there's a sense of hope there, but not if we don't actually pay attention to how they got the fucking power in the first place.
right. Right.
It's it's really annoying. But like in closing on this specific issue, I think that, like I said, the best way to like combat esoteric fascism is to reclaim territory, reclaim lost territory. A lot of these things are not inherently fascistic. They don't belong to fascists. They belong to the human family. And also like study up, get fucking clued in. Like, I don't know what it's gonna take for you fucking people to realize that like the membrane was shattered a long time ago. The membrane that was like keeping all the weird stuff from getting out and bleeding into culture is decimated. So you better fucking get clued in on shit, because like, yeah.
Right. And I would say I would say read their own stuff, because we spend a lot of time reading what other people say about people like Jordan Peterson, but we never actually look or listen to what he himself is saying and try to dismantle it that way. A lot of times the criticisms are just written by people who are trying to get a story out real quick because they had a deadline and they get paid to write these stories. And particularly I saw this with Jack Donovan and the Wolves of Vinland in the United States, where all of these think pieces about him would come out, and you read them and you're like, you haven't actually really read his work. You're just you're hoping he goes away, and you just wrote this because you needed to write it. We need more people actually looking at their ideas, because I know there's a fear of a contagion effect. I think that if you read these people, if you listen to these people, maybe you'll get convinced. But if that's what we're afraid of, then that means they're right, and so we need a better reason, or we need to not be afraid of their ideas. we need people looking at their ideas so that we can fight them. We can't tell people, oh, don't read that, don't look at that, you know, he's all wrong.
It's mostly bollocks anyway. I remember, because people are super afraid of Jordan Peterson, and they don't actually. But I read 12 Rules for Life, and it's a bunch of fucking bullshit. Like, it's not even coherent.
Yeah.
Like, the majority of it's not coherent at all. Like, this is a man who can't like handle apple cider. It like sent him into a fucking spiraling depression. I don't know if you saw that. Like, that was pretty tragic. It was pretty tragic. Like, the guy is I don't know why we're giving them clout.
Right.
Like, the way that this is why I feel like the archetype of the magician needs to be employed, because magicians aren't fools. They're very tactical. They know what the fuck they're doing. They actually, you know, are mindful about the techniques that they employ. They have a knowledge of what's going on around them. And I feel like that's what the right wing has been doing. But we've just kind of been throwing shit at the wall to see what sticks. And like, we need to be more, you know, bold in terms of how we deal with things.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Definitely. But we shall move on to the next question now, which is the final question. And then I'll turn it over to the audience in case anybody wants to ask you any questions or make any comments or add anything. So the final question is symbols, mythologies, and archetypes for the left. What do you think are useful symbols, useful archetypes, and useful mythologies for the left? And do you think that it's important for us to start to create new ones as well?
That's a really good question. You know, I think, you know, I'm still in love with what the Luddites did and what the white boys did and the Rebeccas did. You know, you know, invoking a spiritual being, be that an egregore, a metaphor, or an actual god, you know, in your resistance, in a movement of resistance, is a very powerful thing. And it was a very terrifying thing to the powerful. You know, so as far as like the symbols and metaphors that could be used, you know, those are things that I would do. I mean, you know, there are so many gods of like revolution, you know. Loki is one of those that, like, you know, he brings Ragnarok, like, you know, he destroys the entire order. Dionysus is another one. Dionysus is great. Yeah, you know, the story of Spartacus, you know, the slave who revolted. Spartacus's lover was a female priestess of Dionysus who had done an oracle for him to determine when the initial revolt that went well. You know, she had asked Dionysus when to do it, and Dionysus told her, and then Spartacus led that. You know, I don't think we have to create things. Like, there's so many stories here. The Haitian Revolution was initiated when, you know, at Bois Clément, when they sacrificed a pig and made oaths to Urzuli, you know, and then the next day they revolted and won. Like, you know, there's so much of this everywhere. You know, the animist traditions are rich with these things, you know.
Even closer to home, closer to the 20th century, like, if we're going to look at a figure like Martin Luther King, a lot of the sort of ecclesiastical imagery he used in his speeches, the sort of appeal to Christian imagery and archetypes, was incredibly powerful and like super resonant in terms of how he used these things as an orator in order to ignite and inspire this thing. And I feel like a lot of the modern left, we've not been able to get people in the gut. We're so focused on trying to get people in the intellectual faculties, which is important too, not to dismiss that, but that visceral kind of experience, that transpersonal experience is so fucking powerful. Why do you think Trump is constantly having rallies? I don't know if you've ever been to, I've been to, you know, and witnessed far right rallies here in the UK. There's an energy. I can't even begin to, it's similar to the kind of, if you're kind of sensitive towards that thing anyway, it's similar to the kind of energy at like a rave, a very like Dionysian kind of thing going on. And it's so, it's like they're channeling it. We're sitting on our fucking asses. They're making moves in culture and creating meaning. We're fucking arguing about fucking Marx. Like, sorry, I'm gonna stop now.
Yeah, you're totally right. You know, I think, I feel like other people could probably answer that better, and there's going to be a different answer for lots of people. You know, it's going to be, it has to be culturally relevant, or it has to be part of a culture. You know,
that's
is using it, like the reason why MLK was able to use, you know, Christian spirituality to unite people was because those people were already familiar with it, and he was stating it in a different way, the same way that, you know, the early kind of slave culture around Christianity that created the spirituals, the gospel music, etc., where they were retooling the Old Testament story of the Jews being enslaved in Egypt, and taking it, rewriting it, or reusing it for their own experience, and that was able to, you know, at the very least give many of them hope, but also for many of them to like spark rebellion. Like, you know, we've always done this, people have always done this, and we, you know, the tools are, I think, all around us. We just have to look at them in new ways, you know?
For sure, for sure. And I think that you know, it's really the domain of artists and writers and like creative people to really kind of, you know, give those tools to you know, the movement basically, and find them and kind of repurpose them in different ways that are, you know, suitable towards our new cultural context. It's difficult, obviously, because I don't know what that would look like off the top of my head, but I guess you just have to try. You have to kind of go into it and try and see what sticks in that regard. But yeah, I really do think that, you know, symbols, ritual, you know, all of these things should be playing more of a vital role than they actually do. Even something like the song, the International, that's a spell, you know? That's literally a spell. The feelings that brings up in you because of the long history and the context and I don't know. It's really difficult to explain to, you know, people who don't understand what we're talking about, but I don't know. Yeah, it's pretty something. But yeah, I definitely think that it's something that we should be considering and taking a lot more seriously than we have been. So now I'm going to hand the questions over to the chat. So if anybody has any questions for Rhyd or anything about Gods and Radicals, go ahead and ask now. Yeah. While I'm waiting, do you mind explaining a little bit about some of the books that you guys have on offer on Gods and Radicals? I have my copy of Pagan Anarchism.
Oh, cool.
Right here with me, which is very dog-eared. As you can see, I've been reading it quite a bit. I'm actually supposed to send this to somebody soon, but I'm finding it really difficult to part with, so I'm probably going to keep it for a while. But this is one of their really wonderful pieces of resources. It's basically kind of like the history of anarchism and paganism and how the two things have like worked in tandem. There's some practical information in there, some historic information. I love the front cover. I love the concept of the black and red Madonna. I think that is such, if you guys made little statuettes, I would totally put one on my altar, like
Yeah.
totally.
So, and a fun story about that cover. It's by a artist in Italy. He creates murals of the Virgin. He did one like Our Lady of Refugees, and that one's a very powerful image as well. But yeah, that's his graffiti art. And we asked him for permission, like, you know, we offered to pay him to license it, and he's like, no, do it for free, like, it's fine. But yeah, it's a gorgeous image. Let's see. So our books. Let's see, we've published 14. I think it's 14. Yeah, 14. We let's see. Amongst the books, let's see. We have a journal called A Beautiful Resistance. We have 4 issues of that. Let's see. The first book we published was a Pagan Anti-Capitalist primer. It's like a short introduction to basically what we're about. Pagan Anarchism was the second book we published. Third one was Curse Your Boss, Hex the State, Take Back the World by Dr. Bones. Fourth one, Circling the Star by Anthony Rella. That was probably our most pagan book out of everything we've written so far. And then True to the Earth, which is the book that just came out. It's an excellent book, written by a historian of philosophy, a professor of philosophy, who pretty much lays out how a pagan worldview and the pagan metaphysics is inherently pluralistic versus, you know, our current modern world, which is very monotheistic. There's always one truth. One thing has to fit through everywhere. Communism has to look like this here and also the same way everywhere else in the world, etc. And paganism and pagan cultures, as it were, and he uses it, you know, kind of like the pagan metaphysics, where they weren't necessarily pagan, but indigenous religions as well always had this idea of like multiple truths existing at once. He brings up a lot Akan culture in Africa and in Kenya, where you know, it was believed, or they believe, that it's impossible to come to a truth without a group of people thinking on the group or on the truth together, you know, stuff like that. So anyway, that's a general rundown of our books. We try to keep our prices as low as possible on them. And we pay all of our writers, or we pay the writers who write them 50% of all of the post-cost revenue. So
Wow.
yeah, it's really high. It's because we're Gods and Radicals is nonprofit. Like, there's no boss, there's no owner, there's no one's making profit off of it. So we're able to kind of channel that money back into the creators. So it's a cool model. It's a rare one, you know. But we're able to pay our writers for it, which is awesome.
Yeah, that's really brilliant, really brilliant. I know that your work has been a really amazing resource for me, not just the books but the articles. So I really highly recommend going and visiting Gods and Radicals website, especially if you're a leftist that falls towards the more mystical, occulty, pagan-y side. Because when I found it, it was like a thirsty person in a desert, like reaching a well, because I had been searching for this sort of thing for a really long time, sort of feeling spiritually alienated within the secular left and feeling completely discombobulated within the pagan community. So to find a place where that was happening, where it was leftist politics working in tandem with spirituality, that was really a big deal for me. And I think pagan anarchism here, by the way. Huh? Say that again.
Like there was so cool to hear. Like when you said that, like, you know, when you found it, it's like, that's awesome. So happy.
Well, I mean every word. So yeah, you guys definitely check them out. I think a good start is definitely Pagan Anarchism if you're just kind of curious and want to know a little bit more about the principles that we've been talking about. So now we will move on to the chat. There's a couple of questions there for you. One of which someone's asking us to talk about techno witches. They say that they know a little, but not everything. Will that become as important as we're more online? I honestly don't know that much about the techno witch paradigm. I'm a solitary practitioner, so like what other people are doing doesn't interest me as much as it probably should. But do you have anything to say about that, Rhyd?
This is sometimes where my role as editor and like public voice of gods and radicals versus like my personal opinions kind of like clash. I am certain that there's probably, you know, lots of meaning to be found there. For me, I find like all of my magic, all of my witchcraft is rooted in the earth. And the more wild and less technological an area is, the more raw the magic is, and the more accessible for me. So, you know, it's almost like I'm a little allergic to technology. So I feel like other people could probably answer that question a lot better than I can. I would suggest asking somebody who, you know, I know some people who claim that title, you know, and have said, you know, a lot of stuff about it. You know, it'd be better to ask them, not me.
That's so interesting, because so like there are people whose magic is kind of grounded in technology, people whose forms of magic are grounded in the earth. I'm personally in the ethereal, like straight up, like up in the ether. Like that's my source of inspiration, is like the mind and like the internal kind of landscape and stuff. So obviously, like I was saying before, people are adept in different ways, and I think that that's beautiful and should be encouraged. So if somebody's really great at using technology with magic, then more power to you. So the next question is, somebody's asking this specifically for you. How should people approach ancestor worship who have ancestors that have done terrible acts?
I love this question because I had problems like doing that myself. When you want to get in touch with the ancestors, and you have the sense, or you know historically, oh, you know, this one did this one was a Nazi, this one was a slave owner, this one was, in my case, I have an ancestor who was like a judge who was an awful judge. You know, the trick is, no one has only shitty ancestors. It is impossible to have completely only shitty ancestors, and that there's someone somewhere in your ancestral line who was either harmed by those bad ancestors, or watched what those bad ancestors did and wasn't able to fix it, wasn't able to whatever. The best thing is to contact them. There's always going to be someone in your ancestry who, you know, I think the way I described it recently was, when you go home for Christmas or Thanksgiving or whatever, wherever you're forced to be around your extended family, and you've got that one relative who's really racist, or, you know, subversively racist, or whatever, you know, they just say something awful, or somebody else acts really awful. You are usually not the only one at that table who's feeling uncomfortable with what's happening. There's someone else at the table who hears it and is like, ugh, but they don't know what to say. You have ancestors like that in your history, and contact those, and they're the ones who will help you kind of straighten out the rest of your ancestral line, and maybe even help you find ancestors you didn't know about.
So true. I mean, it's not even just an issue with like white Europeans. Like, I have ancestors who like worked in tandem with the British during like the colonization of Nigeria. And like in certain ways I benefited from that privilege that afforded people. But I also have ancestors who were like resisting it. I was in conversation with my mom the other day, and she was talking to me about my great grandfather, who was the chieftain of Ijebu, which is like my ancestral like land on my mother's side, and he successfully resisted the British takeover / invasion for like 15 years. And he was also like a pretty brutal magician too. Like there's all this folklore and legend around how he like used magic to like disappear and stuff and like all this stuff. And I was like, oh my god, this is so cool. Like what the fuck? Like so you'll have moments where you're not so proud, and then moments where you're like, oh my god, this is amazing. Like this kind of explains a lot. And I also am a huge believer in like ancestral healing and kind of looking at certain traits in the family. It's kind of like the Jungian shadow of the family. Like I feel like every family has its own like egregore almost. And like understanding that can also help you understand a lot about yourself on like a psychological level as well. But yeah, it's a complicated thing that's different for everybody, but like don't be afraid of it is my whole thing. And if it's not for you, then it's not for you. I don't do a whole lot of work with my ancestors. It's only just kind of started to invade my paradigm because of things that have happened in the last year with me finding out information just in a serendipitous way. So they'll come to you or they won't.
Grandfather of yours sounds awesome. Like if you do doing a lot of work, I have fun talking to him. Like, he sounds amazing.
That's if he'll show up. I'm interested. I'm really interested in my family history in that regard because yeah, we were like you know, fucking royalty, and there's a whole lot of ritual that goes into being allowed to be the king of a specific region. You have to be under a specific deity. You have to join secret societies. You have to, because you're not only just the political leader in Yoruba culture, you're also the spiritual leader of the community. There are also female kings, because in Yoruba there's no gender distinction between the word king. A king is a king. So there are also female kings in my family as well, who also had their hands like deep in the pot of like mysticism. So it's just kind of, these are things that I'm only just sort of finding out through talking to family members, talking to grandma, talking to my mom. These little whisperings are just, so it is a really beautiful thing to be able to kind of discover those things, you know. But then there's also the not so pleasant side of like, you know, my great grandfather, which isn't that long ago, you know, really was kind of a shill for the British. And there are a lot of people in my family who actively kind of sold people down the river. So yeah. Yeah. Okay, so the next question is, hang on a second. So this person says, not really a question, but a suggestion, but I feel we need to spread memes in the real world, outside much more, by posters, stickers, spray paint. What are your thoughts? So I say go right ahead, but just make sure that you know what you're doing, because though you can do shitty magic, you can also make a shitty meme. Memes are magic, and unless you're an adept, you're not likely to have a giant effect. Like Coca-Cola, whoever designed the Coca-Cola logo is an adept magician. Mm-hmm. Whoever designed the Nike logo is an adept magician. You probably aren't just yet, or maybe you are, who knows? But you do need to have skill, which is what I'm trying to tell you. Otherwise, it's kind of a waste of time.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. I really think things need to get off of the internet. And I mean, like, things need to be in real life. Like, you know, yeah, I know some people don't really make a distinction between the two, but they need to, because like the way the internet is set up, only people who already have interests that are similar to yours will ever see anything you post on Facebook. You know, same way with blogs, you know, etc. Like, you're not gonna be able to reach people who or even communicate with people who are, you know, not yet politicized or just have like a completely different worldview if you're relying on the internet. But you might be able to communicate with them if you post something on the street that they walk by, you know. And you know, that's a place where again we're seeing fascists being a lot better at postering, you know, a lot better at like putting their stuff up in places where people are going to see it, than the left ever is.
Definitely. I totally agree with that. Yeah. So the next question, someone asked me, what are my thoughts on forming leftist militias? I think it's a great idea. I don't really have much to say, but I definitely do think it's a great idea. I mean, we're talking about, abandoned territory, and how kind of the psycho-spiritual side of things has been abandoned. I also think that violence is something that's also been abandoned by the left, and also kind of this passivity as like pathology kind of thing. And at the same time, the right wing have been stockpiling ammunition and stockpiling weapons, and the same way they have taken full advantage of that specific area of culture that we've neglected, all the areas of culture that we've been puritanical about are now being used and weaponized against us. So yeah, I think in that sense it's a good idea. Do you have anything to say about that, Rhyd?
Yeah, I do. Yes, militias are important.
Mhm.
You know, I will never own a gun myself. I never will. I am a clumsy motherfucker. I don't want something that can kill somebody just sitting around in my house. But yeah, self-defense is important, and self-defense sometimes means offense. But here's the thing. I think the better question is building communities of resistance important? Because militias are not, being armed is not the only thing that needs to be done. There's people who are arming themselves. That is very important. But those same people also need to be the people who are helping plant gardens. Those same people need to be the same ones who are learning, how to do herbalism to help people, get abortions when abortions are illegal. All of those things are needed. And, while, yeah, some of us have strengths and some of us don't, it's super important that we don't replicate the same sort of over cultural thing of like, you're either a fighter or a lover, like it needs to be, we should be teaching old grandmas how to defend themselves. And we should be teaching like the young dudes who are like, yeah, I'm going to fight the fascists, how to knit,
Yeah. 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 I totally agree with that kind of holistic approach. 100%. I couldn't have said it better myself. um, so the next question, the next question's coming from King Peppy. They asked, you mentioned Strina when you were talking about hierarchies, alluding to unions of egoists, I believe. What's your take on anti-abstract thought or spooks and pagan anti-capitalism?
Um, I'm trying to understand the question. So, like as we mentioned before, like spooks are kind of like the same thing as egregores. The I think that there's that sort of raw unconscious that you were talking about. The sort of etheric realm that like to play in and draw your ideas from. That's the same realm that spooks come from. That's but that's also the same realm in which gods live. And I think and that realm doesn't necessarily have to be up here. It can also be down here, like the chthonic and the solar at the same time. Stepping out of the created reality around us and remembering how we can create new realities is kind of essential. And I think that the sort of reintroduction of Stirner back into leftism, which has been happening for I guess about 15 years, but it's really taken place in the last few years. That's really important. Like I tend to look at it like Stirner plus Marx, or like the Stirner is a good way to steer Marxism away from pure materialism, and it's also a good way of like steering anarchism away from pure materialism as well. you know,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, it's really useful and it's really important as it relates to like pagan anti-capitalism. I would just say that I would just say read Dr. Bones's book. You know, he wrote a book that, you know, it's pretty much a Stirnerite anti-capitalist manifesto. Like, you know, it's kind of brilliant. So
definitely, wonderful. I can't really talk much about it because I'm still just getting my Stirner education. I'm not really like I'm not 100% sure about where I stand either. I'm just kind of learning and taking as much in as possible. But what you've said is really fascinating, and I do really have to get my hands on a copy of Dr. Bones's book, definitely. So the next question is, do you have any suggestions for a secular person thinking about honoring Yule? I want to reference myths, but not necessarily worship something. I mean, that's kind of my paradigm. I don't really necessarily worship anything, and there are a lot of people who are occultists and pagans who don't worship anything. There are many paradigms that are conducive towards you remaining secular, but still drawing inspiration and power from archetypical forces. So if you want to honor Yule as a secular person, go right ahead. It's very possible to do so. Rhyd, anything you have to say?
I have an idea for a ritual in here that actually is a really ancient ritual that kind of exists in multiple cultures. I'll tell just a brief story real quick. I was in Newgrange, which is in Ireland. It's an old passage tomb, and at the moment of sunrise on the winter solstice, a shaft of light hits a little opening in it and illuminates the tomb. It happens every year, just for a couple of minutes. And I got to be inside there one time. There's a lottery where they you know, people put their names in and they only pick 50. And it was like, so I got picked out of like 40,000 people, and it was one of the most powerful moments ever, you know. And
Wow.
for me, it had religious significance, but so Yule is the celebration of, you know, if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, it's the shortest day of the year. It is the final death of the sun, as it were. And in the Druid tradition that I was part of for, still am, they do a ritual that is, it doesn't matter your belief, you know, you can believe in nothing at all and still have a really powerful experience just doing this one thing. Light candles and then blow them all out and sit in the darkness at the end of that day, knowing that like that is the you know, the longest night of the year, and you're sitting in darkness, and then light a candle, and in that you experience the birth of light again, because that's what is happening anyway. You know, like a lot of the pagan traditions, you know, are pretty much just descriptions of natural phenomena that industrialized society has taken us away from. We have electric lights now. We barely notice when the sun is setting earlier or later. Getting back in touch with the fact that the year ends, or, you know, we revolve around the sun, and some days are shorter, some days are longer, and there is one day of the year where the night is so long and it's the longest night, and sit in the darkness during that, and then relight a candle, and that is, you know, that can have all sorts of experience or all sorts of transformations for you. You could just look at it as a pretty ritual, and that's still enough, you know, but you could also look at that light as being like, all right, I am over my depression, I'm over my despair. You know, the world seems like it's getting shittier and shittier and darker, but oh, wait, it stopped getting darker. Now it's getting light again. You know, you can look at it, you can write anything you want into that. You don't have to call on gods or spirits or magic or anything else like that. Like that's something I think anybody could do.
I love that. And I love that you mentioned how that sort of thing kind of puts you back in touch with the things that industrial society has divorced you from. I think one of the most important things that my spiritual paradigm has given me is kind of that connection to the wheel of the year. marking the major solstices, marking the major equinoxes, and I kind of see it as a time to look at what's going on psycho-spiritually within me. So like Samhain has just passed, and it was a time for me because, like, you know, the iconography around that time is harvest, but also the dying of the summer as well. So I always look at it as a time for me to reflect on what have I accomplished this year? What is the harvest that I've sort of brought through? And to really honor and celebrate that, but then to also think about the skins that I'm shedding, the things that are being lost, the friendships that, you know, weren't necessarily there anymore. And then kind of like on a macro level, that can also work in the political sense, like you said, with this sort of solstice ritual. There's something so transpersonal and amazing about, you know, the idea of this darkness, and this super dark night that's happening, and then this one ray of light being representative of that hope. Those kinds of rituals, those kinds of transpersonal experiences are the things that we've lost, that can be so healing and really put you back in alignment with not only yourself, but like your community as well.
And I would add one more thing, if
definitely
just the making your own rituals is part of reclaiming our meaning, you know, like, and just like the way that we make rituals around holidays, even if we don't believe in those things or don't even like them, you know, or just the everyday rituals that we make, that's reclaiming ourselves, that's reclaiming our power, you know.
Definitely. Well, yeah, thank you guys so much. This is about all we've got time for, because it's almost 10 o'clock. Fucking hell, we've been at it for quite a while.
Yeah, yeah, that's awesome.
I know. Thank you so much for all of you guys. Thank you so much for all of you who were patient enough to stick around, and for those of you who weren't, I'm going to leave it up so that you can catch the repeat. Thank you so much, especially to those of you who are kind of new to this kind of terrain, and maybe a little weirded out or confused. Thanks for hearing us out, like, and being open-minded. You guys are the best. Thank you so much, Rhyd, for being here today and deciding to join me.
And thank you.
I couldn't thank you enough. It's no problem. It's my pleasure.
Too. Like it's great that you exist.
Oh.
We're doing your work.
Thank you so much. Thank you guys for existing and doing all the work you do. And I strongly, strongly, strongly recommend that you go and check out Gods and Radicals website. I'm going to put it in the description, but I'm sure if you just Google it, you can also find it. My videos are also part of the resources on that website now, which is really amazing. Super huge deal. I'm really excited about that.
So happy to have you.
Thank you guys. Thank you. Thank you guys so much again, and we shall see you later. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.